How's it going, everyone? Schaefer here, back with another final review, this time talking about Lords of the Fallen. Lords of the Fallen is, as you may already know, a Souls-like game, and honestly it shows. Lords of the Fallen is very similar to other Souls games in terms of its core mechanics, the stats, the weapons. You basically level up through what's called Vigor, and spend that Vigor on leveling up stats as you see fit, and to, depending on whatever build it is that you would like to play as. So all of that is not new. If you're a Souls fan, these things are definitely going to feel very familiar, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, Lords of the Fallen does try to do something different, and this takes the form of what's called the Umbral. The Umbral is basically a completely alternative dimension to the standard world. It takes place in the same maps, in the same areas, but going into the Umbral world completely changes the look of it, completely changes the feel of the world. Many of the worlds open up in ways that were otherwise inaccessible, so pathways might open up, gates might disappear that allow you to pass through, ladders also sometimes appear that allow you to climb over, and so it's almost like having two levels packed into one. It also introduces brand new enemy types, although honestly, if I'm speaking truthfully, not necessarily better enemy types. Some of them can be very frustrating. I definitely had a bad time with many of them. Maybe that's just me, but that's how I felt about it. And it also introduces a timed mechanic. And what that means is that essentially the longer you remain in the Umbral world, the more enemies spawn. So the more enemies come after you. They kind of recognize that you're in the Umbral world, so more and more of them spawn. And when your timer reaches the limit, which is indicated at the top right, there's like an eye at the top right hand corner, and when it turns red, you lose the ability to use healing items, so you can't use your standard healing flask or healing item anymore, and a very strong enemy type spawns and kind of hunts you down through the Umbral to try and essentially kill you. So getting out of there, especially around that time, is ideal. I found myself trying to hop in and out as quickly as I could. Not that I didn't necessarily like being in the Umbral, but I also often did find it pretty frustrating because a lot of enemies do spawn, and they do just tend to spawn kind of all over the place. So that was a little bit frustrating, but honestly, the overall idea of the Umbral I really liked. I thought it was such a unique way of looking at it, and I liked the way that it increased or changed the traversal through the worlds. So bridges, doors, that kind of thing that just weren't available before. I thought it was a really nice idea, really unique idea, and certainly sets Lords of the Fallen apart from some of the other Souls-like games that don't have this kind of mechanic in it. So that definitely has it going for it, and I think that's pretty good. And one other thing as well, actually, the bonus component to this Umbral sort of world, this Umbral mechanic, is that it actually gives you a second life. So when you die, if you're not in the Umbral world, so if you die in the normal world, you actually resurrect in the Umbral world. So you don't die like you would in a normal Souls game and lose all of your vigor. You actually just resurrect in the Umbral world, and you can continue to fight, or you can run away and escape, whatever it is that you might be doing. And I use this a number of times to survive encounters. I think I even beat bosses a number of times with using this mechanic. So it definitely makes Lords of the Fallen a lot more accessible. It makes it a lot more forgiving than other Souls games, that's for sure, because you get this extra life, which you just don't normally get. And that's not a bad thing, in my opinion. I think that's actually a good thing. Having it a little bit more accessible, maybe a little bit easier in that sense, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good. And then there's the visuals. In my opinion, Lords of the Fallen is a very pretty game. Some of the environments look great, some of the environment effects look great. The weapons, the armor, just overall, I think it's just got this really good, really unique look to it. There's a lot of old stuff mixed with like castles and ruined worlds. There's also some nice greenery areas and some snow areas that you get to visit. And honestly, I think it looks fantastic. And then there's the Umbral world. In my opinion, it's clear that they spent a lot of time on the Umbral world. It looks fantastic. Everything looks so different from what it would normally look like. You get all these grotesque features and things stood off in the distance. Now, the story of Lords of the Fallen felt fairly standard too, in my opinion. A lot of the time, you were given vague statements or hints for NPCs, and honestly, I got lost a number of times. You know, I found myself unsure of how to progress, where to go, what step to take next. And honestly, sometimes I just stumbled or happened upon a place that I hadn't explored yet or hadn't been to. And while there is a certain charm to that, I did like the fact that sometimes you would just discover where you needed to go by accident, and that does feel pretty good. A lot of the time it's nice to have at least a little bit more of a leading hand to kind of show you or tell you at least, hey, maybe you should have a look over here. And maybe that's just me, maybe I missed some of the points of the dialogue, maybe I didn't quite understand it properly, just how I experienced it. And so it would have sometimes not necessarily be hand-holding me, but sometimes it would have been nice to have maybe just a little more guidance as to, oh hey, you know, maybe you should try looking in this direction. And something just to indicate where I may have wanted to go and visit next, to see what was going on, or what maybe I missed. And because, like other Souls games, Lords of the Fallen has 3 possible endings that I know of. I got the one of the 3, which is obviously one of the 3, which is the Inferno ending. And what I did like was that completing the game with one of these 3 endings gives you a special class to start a new game with, if that's what you want to do. And I believe that the class that it unlocks is different every time, or at least different with every ending that you get. I think if you repeat endings, you might get another one as well, I'm not sure. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea, that you have another starting class to begin with once you complete the game. And so overall, I wasn't disappointed with the story. It was just kind of standard Souls, and that's not really what I played it for. Although some of the points were interesting, and some of the characters I did actually like. They were all voice acted, at least the majority of them were voice acted, and there were some really interesting characters, and some that met specific endings. So you'd have to watch or play to those. I don't want to spoil too much, but some of the characters I did actually really like, and it was interesting to see their story through this game as well. And when I talk about everything that I liked, everything that was good about it, there's also some points that I had a bit of frustration about or with. And one of the things that really kind of... I was just unsure about why this decision was made, and it was the idea that, unlike many other Souls games, your healing flasks can normally be shared between restoring mana and restoring health. In Lords of the Fallen, from what I gathered, you couldn't do it. I didn't find any way to swap between them, so it was just healing flasks, and there was no way to kind of restore mana other than using consumables or finding specific items or runes that you can enchant your weapons with, to increase or give you back mana. And there was a ring I eventually managed to find that also regenerated mana. But other than that, as I specialized in a spell-heavy class, early on in the game, I struggled to keep my mana because I just used it all the time, and there was no way to restore that mana. So I found myself not using my spells as much as I'd like to, or being way too reserved with them instead of using them. And that didn't really feel necessarily great. It would have been nice to have a better way to restore my mana more often, and allowing me to share my flasks between health and mana would have been a perfect way to fix that problem. Why they didn't do that, I'm honestly not sure. I really don't know why that option wasn't in. I was also a little bit disappointed at the lack of weapons for my specific build. As I mentioned before, I used Wither Magic, or Magic, and I used Wither Magic, so I specialized in Wither Magic. And that is essentially the combination of Inferno and Radiance. So when you level up, one of the stats, or 2 of the stats that you can pick are Inferno and Radiance. I was basically leveling up both of those to increase what's known as Wither Magic. And the amount of weapons that had Inferno and Radiance scaling on them was very little. I found very little items that actually benefited my build, and the ones that I did find that had both of those stats in it also typically came with other stat requirements like strength or agility stats that I just wasn't putting any points into, because that's not the idea of how I was playing the game. I was playing it to be a spellcaster, and arguably, yes, I didn't need to use, or at least I shouldn't have had to use a melee weapon as much, so maybe that was the answer. But my counter to that would have been, well, yeah, but as I mentioned before, I ran out of mana constantly, especially in the first half of the game. Before I gained a lot of the runes that I put into my shield, which constantly regenerated mana, and then I bought a ring, which also then continuously regenerated mana as well. Before that, my mana was a big issue, and I continuously ran out. So it was very frustrating to find that there were no decent weapons for my build specifically. In the end, I did settle on one that had Inferno and Radiance, but it also had Strength and Agility. Just fortunately enough for me, those stat requirements on agility and strength were low enough that it didn't make too much of a difference, so I was able to still wear it. Although I did have to put points into strength and agility to be able to wear that weapon. It wasn't something I just had the ability to wear considering my Inferno and Radiant stats were so high. So yeah, I think I would have liked more specific weapons just with Inferno and Radiance, because if you want it to be a Radiance or you want it to be an Inferno build, there are plenty of weapons for those two specializations. Plenty of weapons. Many of them just having the Radiance or just having the Inferno stats requirements. So it would have been nice to have one for Wither. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And lastly, the point I would like to make here is the Lords of the Fallen also introduced another little mechanic other than the Umbral, and it was a temporary vestige mechanic. And the vestiges are like the bonfires. They're where you rest, that's where you level up, and you can warp to and from them as you unlock them to get your way around the world. And essentially, Lords of the Fallen had permanent vestiges that you could open up and you could teleport to and warp to at any point in the game. And it also had flower beds, little flower beds spotted throughout all of the maps. They were kind of all over the place. And these were temporary locations that you could set up a temporary safe point. So you could go to that, you could walk back to that area, you could level up there, you could rest there to reset the zone. All the typical stuff that you would do at a vestige or a bonfire. But in order to create one of these temporary locations, you had to use what was called a vestige seed. Now these things weren't like, you didn't have them constantly. They were a consumable you had to either find, kill an enemy for, or you had to purchase. And so a lot of the time I found myself running around a zone having not had a vestige for a long period of time. So you've got a lot of vigor saved up, you're deep in the level, you don't necessarily want to die at this point and reset and lose everything. You want to be able to rest, and there's no way to rest unless you had a seedling on you. And there were many times I just didn't have that seedling on me. And arguably, yes, I mean, I tried to be more proactive and go out and purchase them so I had more on me. But that always wasn't possible either, because you're halfway through a level, you don't have one. Your only option is to go back, or to teleport back using one of the moths. So it takes you back to the last vestige you rested at, and you'd still lose your progress in the map because you have to go back and rest and then come back out again. And so, I don't know, I mean, for me it was kind of a hit and miss. Sometimes I thought, it's kind of a nice idea to put it in there, it's a little bit interesting, maybe they could be used as like mini checkpoints throughout the game, but then sometimes it felt like you were going way too long without a solid, standard rest area, vestige that you could stop on. And sometimes it was a bit frustrating. Yeah, it was a bit frustrating because I just didn't have the seeds on me. I didn't necessarily want to buy them all the time because they weren't exactly the cheapest things in the world. Well, early on they weren't the cheapest things in the world. And so, I don't know. For me that was hit and miss. Some people might love it, some people might hate this one. I am a little bit on the fence with it. So honestly, this one is up to you to make your own mind up on how you feel about this. I think if I had to pick an answer, I would say that I would have just preferred to have more permanent vestiges rather than temporary ones in between. I think I'd just rather have had more rest stops that were permanent around the world. I think that would have just been better and easier to deal with. I don't think necessarily that the vestige was, that the temporary vestige seeds were necessary. I think it was I think it was an unnecessary mechanic. If I'm being pushed for an answer, that's what I would say. But I mean, some people will hate it, some people will love this mechanic, and I think it is what it is. You know, you'll either will or you won't like it, and that's okay. But with that being said, overall, I did have a lot of fun with Lords of the Fallen. I thought it was a really good Souls-like game. I thought it was a really good game in general. I thought the Umbral world was a super nice mechanic, super interesting mechanic, even if it did have some frustrations with it. This might not be perfect, but hey, if we see a Lords of the Fallen 2, we might see an improved Umbral version, and I think that's a great thing. The endings, I believe, for what I've seen, are very different, all three of them, so it's probably worth going through and playing the game a couple of times. Either in New Game Plus, which is a thing, or in as a new class, maybe the new class that you unlocked at the end of the first playthrough, so you get to see all of the ending. If you're a Souls-like fan, I highly recommend it. If you're looking for your next fix, your next Souls game, this is definitely, in my opinion, up there with some of the good ones. So I would definitely recommend checking it out, having a go for yourself. They're constantly updating it. Since I played it, they've put some really big patches in. One of them increased or altered the way the enemies spawn, or how many enemies spawn and where they spawn, and also changed the difficulty of bosses to make them, I think, more difficult. Because that is one thing I did notice, that sometimes in the game, I mean, I sometimes one-shot some of the bosses without much of a problem, and others I had a lot more trouble with. But the ones that I did kind of go through pretty quickly, they did feel very, very easy to defeat. They weren't very challenging at all. And I believe now everything is a little bit more difficult. I had already played through many of the bosses by the time some of these patches came out, so honestly I can't comment on how much different they feel, but certainly some of the end ones that I ended up fighting, I think, after the patch, they were challenging, they were difficult. I had a tough time with some of them, but overall, I think it's a very approachable game. It's a very decent game. You can obviously summon as well. I didn't ever use the mechanic, but there is a summoning mechanic there as well if you need to. And like I said, with the Umbral, you get like a second chance at the boss, or the fight, or the instance that you're trying to get through. So I think it's very approachable, and definitely one to pick up. So I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.